Good day. I'm Colonel Jerry Morlock, the Director of the Combat Studies Institute. You're about to use a video series which our instructors have prepared for the sole purpose of improving your presentation of M610, The Evolution of Modern Warfare. We've taken care to make the course that you teach as similar to the one taught at Fort Leavenworth as possible, and choose to add these tapes to your libraries in order to give you every advantage as you prepare to teach this new course. These tapes are similar to the weekly train-up sessions which we utilize to prepare our instructors here at Fort Leavenworth. My intent for the tape sessions was to provide you insights and tips on ways to approach the lessons of M610 that were not available in the instructor notes. I've drawn various instructors, military and civilian, into the sessions based upon their specific expertise and historical background. They were asked to just talk to the lesson structure and content, giving you some additional information on the historical context and differing views on how to approach the lessons. These tapes will provide you a wealth of knowledge and direction that will significantly improve your readiness to teach our new history course. One word of caution regarding how to use these training tapes. They are not designed to be substituted for your instruction during the individual lessons of the course. As instructor preparation tapes, train the trainer material if you will, they are inappropriate for direct instruction to students and are not intended for that purpose. Our intent with these tapes is to improve your ability to lead the student seminars by sharing tips and advice from some highly qualified experts. The Combat Studies Institute stands ready to provide whatever additional expertise or assistance that you may require, and we've included the Institute's phone, mail, and email contact information on the tape if you should need it. Good luck with the Evolution of Modern Warfare course, and have a good time.
All right, good day. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Scott Stevenson. I'm the course author for the Resident Military History course at CGSC, and accompanying me today and hopefully providing the knowledge that I might not be able to provide to this session are Lieutenant Colonel Jim Martin and Dr. Sam Lewis. Both of whom will give a little intellectual credibility to this group. At this late stage in your course, it's time to start thinking about how you've seen these sessions we've had here on tape. We're thinking about an award program, and we think perhaps this session might deserve at least consideration for the homeliest trio on tape during our non-resident CGSC instructor prep tapes. No, take this seriously. This is the last lesson. This is the wrap-up for the course that you pose to these students, a chance to tie the threads that you've offered them all through the course. And so I think you want to allocate some time to that. What are the themes that you think the things they should have pulled out of the course? But also you want to hit the material, because in my mind, and I think Sam and Jim would agree with me, that this lesson potentially one of the most interesting, one of the most provocative. It's about the way the Army thinks about its business, how we got to the way we are today, the way we operate today, the doctrine that we use today, in large part based on the way the Army came out of the Vietnam War, how it assessed its experience in the Vietnam War, assessed the new challenges faced by the Warsaw Pact, and then how were they going to adapt to a new world going in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Again, this lesson tells us a lot about the way we think about our business today, and I think it's worthwhile in a way to come back to the themes that you talk about at the very beginning of the course. What are the relationships between history, theory, and doctrine? I'd like to start by asking Sam what kind of approaches in general you'd use to going after this lesson. What do you think?
First of all, I'd agree with your observations that this lesson will stand up on its own as a piece for looking at the U.S. military after the Vietnam War. But it's also an ideal opportunity to examine where we've been, why we're at this particular point, and why we are this way, and what indicators are out there for the use of force into the future. So I always try to use this lesson to wrap it all up. One of the key notions in this lesson is there an American way of war? And throughout the course we've been using the text by Russell Weigley to examine his particular view on the subject. for those new instructors out there, trust your students and trust the readings. Let them attempt to come up with an evaluation of whether there is a unique American way of war, or is it part of something larger, a Western way of war. If it is different, how so and why? What is it like? When Saddam Hussein or a potential enemy of the United States looks at the U.S. military, what do they see? Do they see certain tendencies? Are certain things expected? And can we ourselves rely upon those to be used in the future? That's one notion. James?
Well, I've found that this lesson always for me ends up coming back. My students bring it back a lot to the Gulf War. Your instructor notes talk about maybe how does the Gulf War reflect what's occurred after after Vietnam, and remembering that Korea and Vietnam were not the military experiences we might have liked them to have been. It's not unusual that many of our students will turn to looking at the Gulf War, which turns out the way we do want it to turn out. So don't be afraid if it goes that direction. That's not too unusual. It happens here too.
I would suggest that it's healthy also. In many ways, one can maintain that Desert Storm represents a flowering of American military culture, whether you like it or not. And you notice in the introduction to this week's lesson, the author quoted Colonel Dr. Swain in pointing out some of our more predictable traits. The over-reliance on numbers, the over-reliance on technology, in German they'd say buchstäblich, the regimented, process-oriented.
That's not the way we like to see ourselves, though.
Dr. Swain pointed out that we all like to see ourselves as Pattons, Guderians, and Rommels, and it comes as a shock when someone suggests that we are the slow, plodding, methodical players.
We bludgeon them to death instead of the bold rapier thrust we like to.
This is a good discussion question. You can get a lot of mileage out of this one.
Yeah. I don't think you particularly can if you've got someone who was in 7th Corps. I mean, all they have to do is have read Schwarzkopf's book and the treatment of General Franks in Schwarzkopf's book, and you can get an argument going. And by the way, I use the term argument just as a euphemism for discussion, because a discussion is just an argument among civilized people. But it's you can get a great one going just on that disagreement there, because what Schwarzkopf wanted Franks to be was Patton, and he wasn't. As I think Swain points out, there weren't any Pattons in the desert.
Or if they were, doctrine and training made them behave in a more regimented manner.
You know, Scott, you do something in your class. I mean, when I was a new instructor here, you brought out some charts and things where you show the beginnings of this regimented piece in our Army in the days when you and I came in. We're back from the 75, 76 time frame, and the cornerstone doctrine manuals that we used then and the manuals that flowed from that showed that regimentation that Sam talks about. We just came out of the 73 War Peace not long ago. We talked about that. And some of the things that pop out there, the one that really pops to mind is the Sager. And all of a sudden there was an anti-tank missile out there that could kill an M60 tank.
Incredibly lethal.
And the Army responded to it by becoming, to me, more regimented, like Sam talks about, going numbers focused.
Yeah.
Why don't you share that? I think that's a real good piece.
If I could I'd make a point that you want to allocate time in this lesson toward wrap it up, and you want to talk about where is the Army right now, and what do we know, or what can we project about the future warfare. But the centerpiece of the lesson, quite clearly, is Herbert's deciding what is to be done. The Leavenworth paper, Camouflage Color, talks about the debate over the 76th edition of the FM 100-5, and you need to give that its due, because that piece is a real case study in the way the Army thinks about doctrine. you've got to set that up, though. And again, as Jim has said, in a way, you have to refer back to the '73 war and shaping the way our Army thinks. But you have to go back farther than that to what shaped the mind of the guy who's going to build the doctrine that the Army takes into the post-Vietnam period. This lesson, in large part, is about a guy named Depew. Many of you may not have ever heard of the guy, but Colin Powell said he, more than anybody, shaped the post-Vietnam Army, made it into the success story we took into the Gulf War. Again, that's maybe a controversial point. He obviously, if you read in the Herbert piece, he wouldn't be a fun guy to work for. He's abrasive, he's aggressive, he's opinionated, but he's the guy who shaped that doctrine. And you really have to set this lesson up by talking about what shapes the worldview of this guy as he takes on the business of remaking the Army after the Vietnam War. What do you think are the key things, Sam, that shaped the way he looked at doctrine and its role?
I find Depew fascinating, as I'm sure your students will find him fascinating. One of the things you can ask the students is, what sort of a man was he? What were the influences upon him? I usually wait for a bit to ask that. I'll start off this lesson with the question, what was the strategic situation for the U.S. military and the U.S. Army in 1972 and 1973? What was the major threat? What were the results of our failure in Vietnam? What were the significances of congressional action to do away with the draft? But I use that as a building block to start out from. Then I try to get into the realm of institutions. When we started this class off, we considered the development of the War Department and later general staffs to be a great sign of progress, the wave of the future. 1973 comes along. They are no longer there. Is this progress? What does it represent? What is a TRADOC? What does it do? What's an integration center? What happened to the old war departments and general staffs? Okay, is this part and parcel of the American military culture and experience? That's worth looking at. At this point, I usually bring in Depew. Who was he? Why did he think this way? I ask the students if they have known anyone like Depew. And did they? What was it like working for him? Is Depew typical of the U.S. Army Officer Corps, or is he untypical, exceptional? Where does he stand as a symbol in the evolution of modern warfare? Is he our Napoleon? Is he our Moltke? Or is he our George Steinbrenner? We have gotten some mileage out of that one in the past.
George Steinbrenner.
That's the way I started off.
You know, this question of who was this guy, do the students know who he is? I like to ask them if they ever dug a Depew fighting position.
Yes, I've asked that one too.
Because most of us at one time or another have had to dig one of those, and it makes you wonder, well, who was this guy?
Who was it? Yeah.
And that's probably the first place I ever thought about him, as I was trying to dig a Depew foxhole in the red clay of Georgia, and calling him a number of names. You can reach out and kind of get your students' attention. You'll find that, and I'm sure you've already found by now, that things that you can reduce to a personal level with students get them highly involved. So that's one way I've found you can reach out and grab these guys in this lesson. It's just kind of, after you do that overview, you can reach out with something like that. You know, Scott, you asked about background, and I think with almost any military actor, that you have to look at what's occurred in their life and how that then drives how they think. I mean, we grew up in the post-Vietnam generation, you and I, and that affects our thinking as military men. You know, I was in the Gulf War. That affects my thinking. And I think you have to examine, or get your students to examine, those watershed events in Depew's life. And that's probably World War II and Vietnam. And how the Army performed in Vietnam, which wasn't a positive thing, versus some things that happened in World War II, which was a more positive event, I think shapes Depew's look at the world. It really does. I think you see it in the FM.
I'm constantly struck by his experience in World War II and his interpretation of it. He fought in France and Germany in 1944 and 1945 as a staff officer in the 9th Division, the division that when first committed had a pretty poor combat record, went through a series of division commanders, one relieved after another, and he describes that division as a casualty-producing machine, producing American casualties. That's how badly it fought. He saw the small unit leaders and troops as being mediocre, in his opinion, and needing constant, detailed guidance. He contrasted that with the Germans, who, in his mind, knew all the techniques of combined arms warfare, knew how to sight fighting positions, knew how to make the most of small unit leadership. And he said the American Army didn't look very well by contrast. In fact, he said really what we did, our infantry did during that war, was provide escorts for our forward observers, and we blasted our way slowly across northern France into Germany. Again, going back to this idea of perhaps of American way of war being bludgeoning the enemy rather than something more akin to maneuver warfare. He came out of that with enormous respect for the Germans and some reservations about what kind of doctrine would be appropriate for Americans. He goes on to Vietnam, where he's successful by all accounts, and he comes up with a technique of the pylon, make contact with the smallest possible force, and then pile masses of firepower and troops back on there. It seemed to be successful for him, but of course, Vietnam is not the war he's worried about. Like most of the Army, this is a painful aberration, perhaps, to him. And he's got to face, when he takes over TRADOC, a brand new challenge. So what do you see him thinking about the role for the new TRADOC? What has that got to do for the Army in the post-Vietnam period?
Before addressing that, I'd like to just throw out a brief idea on how to get to a number of these issues. And sometimes I start off the second hour with this question. And I ask, what are the major factors that influence the creation of the 1976 manual? Depew obviously is one, and we should have talked about him in the first hour. What's the nature of the Warsaw Pact? How good are they? What do we think about them? What's the significance of the 73 Arab-Israeli War? Why all of a sudden is the U.S. Army and the U.S. Air Force cooperating, setting up a special cooperation office not too far from Norfolk? I think that's an indicator of how bad things were in 73. And finally, the German Army, both from Depew's experiences with it in World War II, and for what the Bundeswehr is thinking about the defense of Western Europe from 1970 through 1976. As a facilitator, your job is to not list these down on the blackboard in Jominian fashion, but to draw forth these responses from your students and encourage your students to mention these and those other factors which I've forgotten or don't know because I'm not smart enough to, but those are 4 or 5 of the ones that I go with. Depew and the 76 manual is your question for me. The big question in my mind is this manual an aberration, or is this a typical American product? By that I mean a product of the U.S. Army. And I try not to force my opinions on the students. I'll let them wrestle with this. Is he, in fact, a new George Steinbrenner, the boss who dictates everything, who does not trust his subordinates? And for those lawyers out there, I would like to say that I love and respect George Steinbrenner. What's in the 76 manual and why is it this way? There's a certain part of our society that comes out of World War II fascinated by technology, numbers crunching, and our ability to make the atomic bomb, for instance, or put overwhelming masses of firepower on a certain grid on a map. If you go back and look at the 76 manual, there's a lot of that systems analysis type thinking in the manual. I'll frequently ask the students for comments about what the 76 manual represented, but usually I get the best response by asking them what the response of the U.S. Army was to the 76 manual. And the author of the Leavenworth paper does a pretty good job there. They didn't like it. Why didn't they like it? Well, if you talk to if you talk to your fathers and uncles who were around at the time, they'll tell you that the 76 manual was the first manual that told them how to fight, that did not trust them as soldiers and men to use their judgment and their experience. The officer corps resented it for that reason. Alexander Haig was a general alive at the time, and he was powerful enough to stand up to Depew and Tradoc, and he said, there's nothing in this manual about leadership. The principles of war are not mentioned. It has a lot of mathematical formulations, but it doesn't talk about what it really takes to lead men and win in battle. A sound point. I think that was probably a decisive moment when someone that big can come out in public and say that. So that's the way I approach it.
I think one of the key things, phrases Sam used there, was the how to fight. Because we end up coming out of this 76 manual with a whole series of books, which we commonly refer to as how to fight manuals for the company level, the battalion level, the brigade level. And it tells you what it is you're supposed to do. It's like the emplacement and use of a Claymore mine, but at the division level. And I think that represents an even greater frame of thinking like that in the American military system beyond Depew. I think if you look at the Vietnam War, you see this hang up with numbers, body count, a tangible, something you can touch.
Yes.
We see it today in this college where people want a grading standard that you can reach out and touch and feel and see and shape, and they're comfortable with that. And I think that's part of our military.
You can't quantify it, it's not worth doing.
That's right, and that comes from this period of time, I think.
But that also is part of our culture too. You always take your culture.
I guess in this case, the successful Army does reflect the culture from which it comes.
And the unsuccessful,
we certainly see it.
Well, that quantification you see too, and the other piece that sets this up, and I guess the October War too. The Pew's original agenda taking over Tradoc is not necessarily rewrite doctrine, but all of a sudden a new sense of urgency comes over what he's done. And I think Herbert points out, we see the 73 war, and it seems to indicate that our Army has spent 10 years in the jungle and lost an entire march or several marches to the Soviets, who are now have these formidable weapon systems, again, as you point out, for technologically oriented military. It's scary what we see in the deserts of the Sinai and the Golan Heights. BMPs, far better infantry fighting vehicle than anything we have. New air defense systems, the like of which we've got a hint of how good they are over Hanoi and Haiphong, but they're tremendously effective against the Israeli Air Force. PMP bridges, our engineers don't have anything like them. And again, as you pointed out, the Sagar, we don't have anything. Well, the TOW missile perhaps mounted on helicopters can approximate it, but the Soviets clearly have got something that seemed at first as effective and easily portable and available in vast numbers. They are deploying those weapon systems in Eastern Europe in mass quantities, and it's a scary prospect.
Well, and you and I, as students in Tradoc during this period of time, I mean, I'm sure you got it at the armor school. I know I got it at the infantry school. I mean, as a mech infantryman, they spend hours teaching you how to run a Sagar Tiger watch. I mean, how to watch for the puff of smoke, this slow thing coming at you, back down into a depression. Drill. That's right. I mean, they spent hours teaching us. We became so focused on the weapons from that war. And you see it in the manuals. I mean, you've got the graphs that you like to show that show us if you're sitting here, the chance of you being killed is this much, and if you're sitting here, the chance is this much. And those kind of very exact calculations are very much a part of Depew's trade doctrine. And the focus back on the 73 war is very easy to see if I just think back into my basic course in 76.
It sent a shockwave through our Army.
Oh, it did. And that's one of the things we're talking about here with these how to fight manuals. That's his response. And the Army's doctrinal response to those issues.
There's another piece to this as well, is the Army, as worried as it is about the threat, has recently, when Depew takes over Trade Doc, has recently lost some procurement battles. It hasn't been able to say very clearly what it needs to face that threat. So it lost the battle over the MBT-70, it lost the battle over the Cheyenne helicopter. So the Army's doing a bad job on Capitol Hill. And how do you argue for the kind of weapon systems you need? Well, Depew says doctrine can play a role in that as well. What would you add on that, Sam? What do you think?
I think there is a tendency to forget what a rude shock the 73 war was, not just for the U.S. Army, but for the U.S. military and other militaries around the world to get the reports in on the new weapon systems. In the past, I've had some success asking the students about their branch. What was happening in your branch because of the 73 war? Or returning from Vietnam to help set the stage and get a lot of mileage out of that.
Well, I can recall in the Armor School in the mid-70s as a young lieutenant having to memorize the position of every single vehicle in a motorized rifle regiment in the approach march. And then how does it look in attack formation, being able to identify where the BMPs are, the T-72s, and then having to crank it some level of detail, what we call the time battle calculus, and we still use that to a certain extent, but figuring out the force ratios, the mathematical calculations, how many weapon systems firing at what rate, in what kind of engagement area will quote, this is a big term in service, that number of targets as they come roaring into your engagement area. Again, it comes back to the kind of numerical approach to fighting.
Well, and you know, I found it amazing. The young budding lieutenants like us are imbued with this in the basic course, and out we go into the Army. And you talk about how it's not received well out in the Army. You tell a story about popping out there as a staff officer. Okay.
It doesn't reflect well on you. Would you like to hear? All right.
But it's indicative of what we're talking about versus the Army at large, how they accept this, and what's being taught in the trade doc schools.
It was a CPX in well, I won't tell what unit it was in, but as a brand new S3 just out of the Armor Advanced course, we were taught to put all our weapon systems up front because that's the only way we could get the right force ratios to take on the anticipated attack of a motorized rifle regiment reinforced. My battalion commander said, looking at the defensive problem, we need to keep a reserve. You can't predict how this battle is going to go. Common sense, prudence, everything I've learned says we need to keep a reserve. I said, sir, the doctrine that's coming out from the Armor School says put your weapon systems out there where they can service the adequate number of targets. So we put at that time, 3 company teams online. The enemy came, but then another enemy force blew in through a flank from our unit to our right, and all of a sudden he was behind us. We had no force to respond to that. It was a game, set, and match. It was over. Yeah, we'd done the doctrinal thing, and we had been wrong. We looked bad. This was a CPX done in front of the division commander. Our battalion clearly had lost the fight, and I was deeply humiliated about putting my battalion commander, recommending the doctrinal solution when really common military sense would have given the better solution.
But see, that goes, I think, to a mixture of what we've talked about here for the last little while. The battalion commander out there goes, it doesn't make sense to me. But since it's training, it's not really soldiers' lives. Fine. You know, we try what the doctrine says. But that's why I think some of these guys were resistant. It didn't allow for the common sense. You called it leadership. It didn't allow for leadership, for common sense, for looking at a piece of ground and doing situational awareness. It said...
Now you're using buzzwords.
That's right. Yes, I am. Here's a piece of ground. We drew it out. This nice chart show you how to set up your area. No, you know, you shouldn't have it there. The book says it should be here. Okay, and that was the mindset that was being taught, doctrine that was being being taught in the TRADOC schools at the time, going right down through the Depew methodology. And you know, he likes the quote here in your instructor's guide is that he believed manuals needed to express certainties clearly. He saw things in black and white. This is where you put Depew foxholes, and this is how they're dug. Okay, and this is where you put tanks, and this is how you put weapons to service targets. And it didn't allow for that common sense. And that's why I think a lot of people out there had problems with those ideas. And you know, I only embarrass you with that story because it's a beautiful segue between these two issues.
Yes, it works.
Because, you know, I mean, I embarrass you with that story in my class. Of course, I always say it's you and not me. But, you know, I think it points that out. And, you know, you don't have to use Scott's name, but that kind of an issue points it out. Again, brings it down to the point where these soldiers will understand it much better than, you know, some, you know, broader context.
One of the things I like to get at in this lesson, there's a tendency among students here at CGSC, and I'm pretty confident for the folks that you'll see out there, unless they've been around a while and had a variety of experience, to think that doctrine descends on pillars from on high, that it is absolutely the result of a rational actor model of development rather than the function of something that can be a very human process. Where egos and personalities and prejudices are involved. But I think Herbert lets your students see how that all works. Would either one of you comment about the process of how Depew gets this book put out on the street the way he wants it to look, despite the resistance in the Army? What do you think?
I would suggest that it goes all the way back to lessons 1 and 2. What is doctrine? What happens if someone in your institution all of a sudden gets a lot of power and is able to produce a manual telling them how to fight? And what happens if the rest of the institution disagrees with it? Is that really doctrine? Don't forget the second half of the book by Herbert. How do you change something that you don't like? What really is doctrine? And I suspect that doctrine is the collective knowledge and experience and values of your institution. That even if someone like Depew comes along and forces a manual on you, you may say, salute and say 3 bags full for the first couple of years, but your guys are eventually going to turn it around and produce something much more akin to what your real doctrine is.
Well, I like to go back here all the way to lesson 1 also, where we talk about the relationship of theory, doctrine, history. And I think this is a great one to show how history is related to doctrine. Because what have we talked about? We've talked about the impact of his experience in World War II, the impact of the experience in Vietnam, the impact of the '73 war. Those are all historical events. And we've talked about how that history has shaped doctrine and how doctrine has responded to those events. So I like to take them full circle and say, you know, we told you that this was true, that these things were interactive. All right, and here's a beautiful example of how historical events drive an historical actor to put out doctrine. Now, whether it's accepted or not, is it really doctrine? But he puts it out, and you can see the influences of those historical events in his life. So I like that way to, you know, to tie this back together, back all the way 16 lessons. So I think that works pretty well.
I like to emphasize the point about military culture. He has his own set of experiences, but there are people with other agendas in the Army. For example, the infantry school. They look at that manual and they see very little mention of the other kind of things the Army has to do. The contingency operations, the operations in the Third World. They see an almost exclusive focus on the Fulda Gap, and they're saying this manual doesn't cut it. It doesn't describe the full range of things that the Army might be called on to do. It doesn't reflect our experience in Vietnam. If you look in the annexes to the book, it talks about terrain and weather conditions in central Germany. It doesn't talk about the gamut of things the Army might have to do, and for that reason, they're dissatisfied with what's in the manual. And that's part of the rejection that you see there. There's another piece of it. Well, there's several other pieces of why I got rejected. But anything, would you comment on any other aspects of the manual that tell us something about American military culture, the relation to history, theory, and doctrine?
Yes, I would suggest asking the students about what they think about the process of overcoming the 76 manual and replacing it with something better. And what does that tell us about where we're at today and where we're going in the future? Do you in fact need a salesman to go out and convince the rest of the Army that this new 82 manual is going to be the wave of the future? What are the roles of the other generals? Who is going to write the manual? Where is it done? Sometimes the manuals are written right here at Leavenworth. Sometimes they're written by the Boathouse Gang in Virginia. Sometimes they're written by folks over at Sam's. Who writes it? Why? Who has input into it? What does that tell us about the institution? Is the Air Force cut off on it? Is the Navy cut off on it? How about our allies? How complex has it become?
I think this is especially interesting in light of the fact that at the end of this year, 1997, we'll have a new 100-5 on the street that at first blush looks like it will change the way we think about operations. And I'll tell you that again, it's not. It is the function of key players putting their inputs in, a new strategy, a new missions for the Army. And again, you can use what's coming out in 97 to look back at what happened before, bounce back and forth to get some idea of what role does doctrine properly play. I don't know, would you comment on that, Jim?
Well, you know, the thing that has bothered me about this manual and the role doctrine plays in this period of time.
You're talking about the 76 manual?
Yeah, the 76 manual. I think it starts an argument, and I may be wrong, the argument may go even farther back. It starts an argument that is still alive and well in our system of training and doctrine. And that's that issue of training and education that we deal with here all the time. I mean, this is, you know, in your book you'll find some issues on Depew versus Cushman. Cushman representing, though it may be an erroneous representation of the scholar who's looking for education. It may well be it's just a personal thing that he doesn't agree with Depew, and that's the other side to take. But this issue of, do we teach someone how to emplace a claim or mind, or do we teach them a broader contextual understanding of why you use it, when you use it, so that you don't teach them what to think, you teach them how to think. And that's what this course has been about. And
the problem for TRADOC is that they're responsible for the training of the newest recruit, all the way up to and including the use of large units, joint and combined, corps, yeah. Armies and corps, and thinking at the strategic level too. Where do you do what piece of training? Where does education come in, if at all? You're entirely right.
Yeah.
And if you want to get a discussion going in your class, if things start to lag in this lesson, if you want to bring out that training versus education piece, I mean, while the Depew-Cushman argument, you know, shows it fomenting there, most groups I've been in, if you start that particular discussion, your problem is you're going to have to stop it, because it'll go on for an extended period of time, because most people have some opinions on that issue. Our students do here about
and the big issue is why we're all here looking at these things, because how will the U.S. military prepare its leaders for combat in 2020 and 2030? What do you want to train them to do? To dig the two-man foxhole, or to think about change and how to deal with it, and how to build flexibility into the system? And that's why we're all here, basically. utilizing it.
I think while you're on it, another question you might ask is about that Leavenworth paper itself. It's written by a guy, Herbert, who does a good job, I think, of describing the process, but I think he brings his own prejudices to the book as well. If you look at his background at the back of the book.
Prejudice is a strong word. Can we say baggage? We all bring a bunch of stuff, baggage, to whatever.
Okay, I'll agree with baggage. Mm-hmm. He's a light infantryman. Most recent experience, I think, when he wrote the piece was with the 101st. That is the community within the Army that perhaps reacted most hostile fashion to what Depew was putting out in the 76 edition. Is he unfairly critical of Depew, perhaps, because of his background? Is he perhaps unfairly praising Cushman, who had been part of that sub-community of his Army? You realize, again, even out in all aspects, whether it's the Reserve, the National Guard, or the active Army, there's a real complex animal out there, and people with a lot of different worldviews involved. And when it comes to putting a doctrine out, all those worldviews are going to try to be represented. Herbert, I think, bring that baggage. Baggage may be the right word.
Well, you see the same thing in an article which we give our students here, but we don't give to you simply because there isn't time, and that's Dan Bolger's Ghost of Omdurman. Mm-hmm. Now, you have the same thing. You have a successful armored war, mm-hmm. and here is Dan, who is one of the brightest minds in the Army today, mm-hmm. but who is a marked light infantryman, mm-hmm. Going back with much that same baggage that Herbert has, going, yeah, but this is just an aberration. Yeah. So there are communities within our armed forces, and you see them reflected in our history and how they respond to different doctrine, or how doctrine gets written based on what community is dominant at that moment in our armed forces.
But there's another issue I'd like to talk about. I don't know how well this will show up. Maybe we can superimpose it on the screen. This is one of the most criticized aspects of the new doctrine. This is the active defense. This is how we're going to defend Western Europe in the mid-70s. This particular diagram is taken from FM 71-100, describes division operations. What you see is division arrayed in the defense, 3 brigades across. What you'll notice is there's no reserve. Excuse me, and as you see a Soviet threat main attack coming into one of the brigade areas, you see helicopters reacting within the battle area here, and you see units reacting nimbly across the division area from one brigade to the other, perhaps in contact, but they're moving in to reinforce, to, quote, thicken the battle as the enemy threat comes in. The Army looked at this with, well, scorn is one word. This is what I was taught.
Yeah, this is the sketch that he was using on that CPX.
I'm not going to get away from that. Hey, you're going to keep bringing up the past. All right.
We treat it as a learning experience.
Okay. And I hope you get a chance to look at this. This comes, again, from page 519 of the 71-100. What it shows is, well, we'll talk about the reaction to this. Army officers looked at it and said, wait a second, units in contact can't just pull out of contact and go over and fight a battle in another part of a division sector. And oh, by the way, who's controlling the tempo of the fight? And as you fight one echelon here, who's controlling the arrival of the following echelon? This is where we start to ask the questions about where is there a need for deep operations? And why are you using your helicopters here to fight within your defensive area instead of going deeper to fight the battle here and controlling the actual tempo of the fight? General Starry was one of the ones that first realized the limitations, even though he was a point man for Depew in getting this manual written and put out on the street. He went over to Germany shortly afterwards as a corps commander, and he started to see the flaws in what he helped create. He realized that the enemy in this scenario was going to control the initiative, the tempo of the fight, and that he didn't have the assets, the weapon systems, or the ability to pull off something like this. And he started to rethink it. He's going to be one of the leaders in rethinking.
And the reaction, I think, to that, today we see, at least until the new manual comes out, we see an emphasis on synchronization. We teach synchronization matrices, matrices. And that battle that you display on that particular graphic, I mean, how do you synchronize that? how do you synchronize the movement of a unit in contact from the right side back to the left? And there's no easy way to do that. There's no way to control it. The lack of using aircraft to go deep to start using their capabilities early. I think you may see our movement towards more synchronization to try to deal with what we see in some of the deficiencies in that particular piece.
We're rapidly running out of time here. I'd like to ask the two of you one question. How has the U.S. Army changed from 1973 to 1997?
Ooh. Well, let me offer you this question as a way to ask students that same question. What I do in the last class is say, picture yourself in the Center for Anti-American Studies in some hostile capital, perhaps in Southwest Asia, where it has students from a variety of countries that are hostile to the United States, and you're doing a study on Anti-American Studies 101, the American way of war. Based on what you've learned, what is it? And ask them to describe what is the American way of war and how would you take these guys on based on what you've seen in this lesson and previous lessons. What kind of thinking would you use?
What's their style? What do they do?
Yeah. That would be one approach to asking students, coming back to that same question. How have they changed? Are they lockstep like this? Are they flexible? Do they emphasize maneuver? Do they, or are they strictly about firepower? Do they excessively rely on technology? Those are the kind of questions I think I'd throw back at students to say, have we changed from this, or this is really reflect the 76th edition who we are? What do you think, Jim?
Well, I agree with you. Those questions would all work. And I think, the idea of the reliance on firepower. Now, whether I would agree with, some people have said the over-reliance on firepower. I'm not sure if I totally agree with that. And the folks who paint what occurs in the desert as a negative, the putting together of the fist instead of the rapier-like. Well, how many guys do you lose in the rapier-like versus how many we lost in the fist? And did we win? Oh, yes, we did. Then I'm not sure it's an aberration. But
you were there.
That's right.
You're bringing
one of the differences. I have baggage. Every historian has baggage, folks. Don't let them tell you they're objective. It's a lie. But I think a major difference that I see between, say, our Army today and our Army in '76 when I came in is that we were totally oriented on the defense when I came in. Totally, utterly, active defense. It was all full to gap, yes it was, but it was all defensive in nature. The Gulf War is the first time when we step out and approach things in the context of large units in an offensive manner. We now step out and do to someone what we were afraid the Soviets were going to do to us. Okay? We have a much more offensive posture today, I think, than we did when I came in the Army in '76. We always focused on the defense in '76.
Well, we've seen an advanced cut of the new manual. We're seeing it goes beyond just war fighting the way we understand it. It talks about a continuum of operations, and it puts what we had called in the past operations other than the war in the same continuum as thermonuclear exchanges, and suggests that the same principles and tenets apply to that at one end of the spectrum as the other. And that's drawn some criticism from people in our department, from students that I've shown the manual to. What I think is that we ought to approach all doctrine with a critical eye, and one of the tools of doing that is history. And that may be the kind of thing you use to segue in the finale. What role is history? How does it help you get at, quote, the best available thought, which is what doctrine should be? Any thoughts on that, Sam?
I like to wrap up the class by asking the students, where have we come and where are we going into the future? Not just the United States and its use of force, but the experience in general too. How appropriate would these be for a nation like China or India, for example? What is happening in the world today that will influence the use of force tomorrow? In 2020 and 2030 are always the terms that I try to mention to my students.
Well, I do something very similar. I continue to try to tell my students throughout the course that, the use of history is not just to figure out what happened in the past, but to figure out what happened in the past and how it can help us in the future. And I like to use myself as an example instead of Scott this time, and say, you know, look, 20 years ago, 20 plus years ago, the 76 manual is what I came in the Army with. I mean, it's what I grew up with. And I look now 22 years later and go, well, geez, those are some silly things that we did. But they made all the sense in the world then.
You have to put them in their perspective.
That's right. And what I think the successful militaries do is, you know, guys like me don't just look back 22 years later and say, well, geez, that didn't make sense. The really successful guys look today at what happened in the past and figure out where it is we have to be in the future. Okay, and that's the challenge I try to leave my students with the thought-provoking issues that are here with the 76 manuals, particularly because, you know, if there's a lieutenant colonel out there who's teaching this, he's probably about the same time frame as I am, and he goes back towards this manual. And you can use that as an example to say, you know, guys, I mean, learn from the past, but use it to help you look into the future. Because our Army's about to change again. It's coming. I mean, information age technology. I mean, you know, we're 20 years from now, we probably won't recognize ourselves much as, you know, the guys from 76. If they went into isolation and came out and saw it today, they'd say, whoa, how'd this happen? So yeah, I like to leave the class with that. I like to end with a look of, okay, you know, we've seen the past, but how do you use the past in preparing for the future? The relevancy of history.
Yeah, I would tell instructors out there that when you get to this point, you're maybe facing a big challenge. And my thought on this, after teaching this course at, and maybe I shouldn't say this, but I will anyway, I'm teaching this course for a few years here at CJSC. I'm not sure you're going to reach all of them. There are a lot of students who will walk away from a military history course and not really be able to judge the relevance of it. Will not walk away and be able to use military history as a tool in their decision making. It's a jump, a challenge that they're not going to make. Accept that. Try to reach the ones, the ones who are curious, the ones who are open-minded, and I think, and allow for the fact that not everybody is going to be able to walk away from a military history course, being able to put this into their toolkit. What do you think, Sam?
Unfortunately, yes, you're certainly right. But on the other hand, there are many who will be able to take advantage of this. Colonel Swain said the final examination for this class is when you all go out into the field and face change. And in many ways, he's right.
I agree. I think that's probably as good a way as I can think of to wrap this up. Good luck, and I hope you have a productive and provocative discussion in classes. I think you'll find this a rich lesson.